The highest things in life are useless because they're done for their own sake. But I think we have so hyper-emphasized the useful that people are often lost. They don't know what to do with their useless time. And therefore, it's filled up with a lot of triviality.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. Joining me from the Santa Barbara studio is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, always a joy to be on with you. How's little Gilbert doing?
He's good. He's walking around causing terror. He's taking swimming lessons now, which is, something that all families in Florida have to do when their kids are just a couple years old, and he's almost floating.
Is he like his namesake yet anyway?
He's
like
rotund,
Gilbert Keith
so
Chesterton? Yeah. Is he rotund? Okay.
Hey, I've liked seeing a lot of the pictures and videos coming out of Santa Barbara as you guys tried to figure out creative ways to still worship and share the sacraments and the liturgy with people. Of course, you did your daily online masses for a while, but in your local region of Santa Barbara, one cool thing you recently did was there was a whole drive-in service at a nearby parish where you offered benediction, sort of a liturgy of the word. Talk about that. How'd that come about and how'd it go?
Oh, it was marvelous. It was just, prior to getting the permission to bring people back to church, so we didn't have that yet, but the county said we could have an outdoor service if people stayed in their cars and didn't receive communion. So I said, yeah, let's do it. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's something we can do. So I did it in two places, one up in Santa Maria, which is about an hour north of Santa Barbara, and then another one in Carpinteria, which is about 20 minutes south of me. And in each place we gathered, I don't know, maybe 200 cars, but each car I'd say had at least 2, 3, sometimes 4 people in them. So there were a lot of people there. And we got up on a little dais with the good sound system. And so we did basically the liturgy of the word for Pentecost. And then a benediction. And it was very moving to me. We brought out the Blessed Sacrament and did the benediction. But just to have people there, they wanted to be in the presence of the Eucharistic Lord, And it was powerful for them. We had pictures of people weeping, They've been starving for the Eucharist. And it was almost like looking through the window of a bakery, I suppose, where you can't have the bread yet, but you're sensing it, So I was very moved by it. In both places, there was a marvelous turnout, a marvelous enthusiasm. One of my favorite moments happened in both places. At the end, the pastor got up and just said, it was wonderful to have everybody here, and we can't really see you. I wonder if you could somehow signal. So all these hands came out the window, but then people started to honk. And before you knew it, all the horns were honking. And it was like a little, like a little alleluia, a little liturgical expression. And the same thing happened in Carpinteria. At the end, as I was walking off, the horn started. Then everyone's horn was blowing, I don't know, I just loved it.
It's like the spirit groans in rumblings that even the heart can't understand.
Exactly, right.
Listen, today we're going to talk about the topic of distraction. Now, you and I have mentioned this on several episodes, especially the ones where we talk about social media and phones and their addictive qualities and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's any surprise to viewers of this episode, especially if you're watching it on your phone or on social media or whatever, that we're all hyper distracted. We feel pulled in a million directions. It's hard to focus on just one thing for an extended period of time. I think of Pascal's great quote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Do you think that quote is still true 400 years after he uttered it?
Oh, it's truer than it was when he uttered it. And what he meant, of course, was we distract ourselves so readily from the great questions that ought to preoccupy us. When you sit by yourself alone in a room, I know it's maybe an introvert's dream, but it means I got the time and the space to think about God, about the meaning of my life, about who I am and what I'm doing. The trouble, Pascal said a long time ago, was divertissement in his French, diversions or distractions. And to be fair, he had a problem with this. He was somewhat addicted to gambling. And of course, Pascal is the famous wager of Pascal. Well, that's grounded in a way in his typical distraction of gambling. But he knew that he was frittering a lot of his life away. Now here's Pascal, one of the great geniuses who accomplished more than almost anyone. But yet he himself thought, I frittered a lot of my life away with idle distractions. So he felt most of us most of the time. And I think, that's not a bad way to examine your conscience at the end of the day, is to go back and say, okay, how much of my day was spent in kind of trivial stuff, just distracting myself from the really essential matters?
Bishop, I think if anyone's self-reflecting honestly, they'll admit that they have way too many distractions in their lives, yet at the same time, we keep coming back to them. Why do we put up with all these distractions? Why do we keep going back to them?
Because we like them, because of Pascal's point that we'd rather do that. It's hard to sit by yourself alone in a room. It's hard to wrestle with the really important questions. And so, of course, we prefer distractions. We prefer triviality. Now, look, I get it. You can't spend every moment of your life wrestling with the profoundest questions. I get it. Of course, we need, lighter, more trivial things. But do we spend most of our time doing that? One way to distinguish it, Brandon, is between leisure activity that's more contemplative in nature versus trivial or frivolous leisure activity. And that's an important distinction because you can be involved in leisure activity, let's say. You're not working, or maybe you're not wrestling with the most profound questions, but you're engaged in something contemplative, and that's all to the good. I think of, as a sports fan watching a baseball game, that's not really a divertissement in Pascal's sense, like an idle distraction. I think that's a form of contemplation. We can say more about that, but I'd make perhaps that distinction too, lest you think everyone should become a monk and spend their entire life in a cell wrestling with the most difficult questions. I wouldn't want to go that far, but we've gone to the other extreme.
We're going to talk a little bit here in a moment about leisure. That's part of the reason why we titled this episode Distraction and Useless Things. Useless things being a good, not something we should avoid. We need things that we do for their own sake, not because they're useful for something else. But I want to, before we get there, spend a little time talking about this 2018 book. It's by Maggie Jackson, who has become sort of an expert in this realm of human distraction, and it's titled Distracted: Reclaiming Our Focus in a World of Lost Attention. She makes the point that a lot of the things that we get distracted by are good. They draw us towards some good end. However, these perceived goods actually drift us further from the ultimate goods. And she gives 3 examples. I want to spend a little time talking with you about each one of them. First of all, multitasking. She says the BlackBerry, at that time, now the iPhone, fulfills a longing in our American culture psyche that since work is perceived to be virtuous, the more we work, the more virtuous we are, then being able to multitask means we're more virtuous. We're always ready to take emails, always ready to answer a phone call, even if that means putting on hold what's in front of us. What's the danger of this multitasking dependency?
I think of it a lot. I travel a lot. I'm on airplanes. And, of course, you can't be on the iPhone when the plane's actually flying. But, when you're waiting in the waiting area and then you get on the plane, people are just, I remember so often thinking, can't that wait? I know you're dealing with some, businessman. That can't wait for a couple of hours. You have to do that right now. And so, it's introduced us to this sort of constant plugged in mentality. What's wrong with saying, no, part of the day I'm really unplugged from all that? Even though traveling is difficult in a lot of ways, there's something kind of nice. Like when I go traveling, I usually bring a book or like a more serious book. Because my move on a plane or a waiting area is to kind of cocoon. I kind of go in my own little space and I block out things and I'm really going to concentrate. Because in a way on the plane, you don't have a lot of distractions. You're sitting in your chair. You could turn on the movie or something if you want, but there you are. And you don't know the people on either side of you, so you don't have to talk to them really. And you can focus. That's a contemplative sort of move. But very often people do the other thing is they say, no, I'll just keep working until the very last minute. Maybe unplug and contemplate rather than work.
It seems like the whole culture is fighting against this tendency to just focus, I'm thinking about airplanes and air travel specifically. I'm like you. I see airplanes as the best time to read.
Yeah.
It's my most contemplative time. I don't have obligations for kids or for work. I can just sit and
Yeah.
read. But even then, the little TV in front of you is like turning on automatically, even when I'm trying to turn it off, or there's announcements over the speakers. And when you get to the airport, a lot of restaurants and airports now set up iPads bolted to the table in front of you, not just to take your order, but to play games and stuff. And I'm like, I just want to focus on the person in front of me or the book that I'm holding. It feels like you're fighting a huge uphill battle.
Yeah, and all the time. And it's again that distinction between work and contemplation. Work is good. I mean, that's true in the biblical tradition. It's true in the great philosophical tradition. We all know that. Now, work I'm defining here as some practical activity that we do for the sake of some greater end. So you go to work in order that you might, get the money which you need to take care of your family. You go to work that you might have the money you need to pay for your apartment or whatever it is. Fine. But then what do you do when you do have that time? When you are actually with your family, they've been fed, you're now home in your apartment that you've paid for through your work. Now what do you do? And see, I find people often have a hard time answering that question. What do I do when the goal of my working has been achieved? See, the useful has done its thing, which is great. Now comes the beautiful time for the useless. And you mentioned that earlier. That's Aristotle's great intuition. The highest things in life are useless because they're done for their own sake. But I think we have so hyper-emphasized the useful that people are often lost. They don't know what to do with their useless time. And therefore, it's filled up with a lot of triviality. It's filled up with divertissement rather than with legitimate objects of contemplation, if I can put it that way. One of which might be, I love when parents do this. They'll talk about just looking at their kids can be a great source of joy, and I mean joy like with a capital J, like a deep sense of the meaningfulness of their life. That's a contemplative exercise. Playing with your kids is a contemplative exercise, right? Because it's useless, but you're spending time in this joyful activity with your kids. Reading a book or watching a film or going to a baseball game, those too are contemplative activities. I think in our culture we grossly underplay all of that. We don't train people how to do it. We train them in the work mode, the useful mode. But the useless side of life, we don't. And therefore it does get filled up with divertissement, and that causes spiritual trouble.
In her book, Distracted, Maggie Johnson mentions a second culprit behind this distraction culture. The first is sort of multitasking and this emphasis on work. The second, though, is speed and efficiency. So we're always trying to find the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to get something done and to maximize our output. I've noticed, though, especially among millennials and Gen Zers, there's sort of a return to the slow, the non-digital ways of doing things that are less efficient, that take longer, but they're doing them on purpose because there's a value in not just trying to maximize your potential. But I found if that's your goal, if you're just trying to complete as many projects as possible, people become, in her words, administrative appendages. They're just sort of cogs in the machine of your efficient life. Then distraction is the inevitable outcome because there's just so much going on.
Yeah. Years ago, I used to give a mission, a parish mission, and it was called Food for the Soul. What is the soul like? And one of my themes there was, the soul likes to go slow. So we are addicted to speed, that's true. We like speed in everything. Fast connection. This is a faster program, that gets me. All right, but then when you've quickly gotten all these tasks done, you've quickly gotten where you want to go, now what do you do? See, because now the soul kicks in. The soul likes useless things, and useless things should be done slowly because you're meant to savor them, not race your way through them, right? Think of people, and it's largely lost art in America, but when I was in Europe studying, you'd see this. You see it still now in Rome when you go there. People that know how to savor a meal. You know the way Europeans eat. You get to a restaurant and you're just there. You're just, long as they gave you a table, order your food. The food comes slowly, a bit at a time. You savor it, you linger over it, you spend many hours in conversation. It's not at all unusual in Europe. Start eating at, you get there at 7:30, dinner comes maybe 8-ish or so. It's now 10:30. You're having your after dinner drink or something, you're still talking. That's not indulgence, or that's not something decadent. There's something beautiful about that. It's someone who knows how to go slow through this great event of eating and socializing and spending time with. What do we do now? I'm guilty of this too. Get to the restaurant, where's that waiter? Where's the waiter? Come on, let's order. The food comes, and then how often, look around a restaurant in America, what you'll see is people now, they're all together at the table, but they're all like this, right? They're all looking at their phones. No, this is the time for you to talk to each other, look at each other, listen to each other. I'm a baseball fan. A classic critique of baseball, and there's something to it because the game has gotten too long. I agree with that. But a classic critique is, baseball, come on, it's so slow. I mean, come to hours and hours. No, but you're meant to savor a baseball game. You're meant to spend a lot of time with it, looking and listening and watching what's going on. That's a lost art.
Well, Maggie Jackson has a bunch more analysis of how we became such a distracted culture. So I encourage people to check out her book. Again, it's titled Distracted 2018. But I want to spend the rest of this episode on practices we can adopt to alleviate our hyper-distracted lifestyles. The first one, and I think we've hinted at it a few times already, is to favor leisure and useless things. And I think here, not just of the ancient Greek philosophers, but more contemporary people like Romano Guardini, Joseph Pieper, his writings on leisure, and the late Roger Scruton, who wrote a lot on quote-unquote useless things and their value. How do we find things, Bishop, that are properly leisure and useless things, and how do we stick with them instead of getting distracted by other things?
Don't you love people? I think of William F. Buckley. I'm dating myself here a bit, but prominent figure some years ago. But Buckley was a great social commentator, political commentator, but he was a man of great passions, and one of them was sailing. And he was a sailboat, these large ocean-crossing vessels. And Buckley has these wonderful books about when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean with friends, crossed the Pacific Ocean with friends, and the great adventure of that, and loading the food and the wine onto the ship for their leisurely, elegant meals and so on. But also talking about navigation, talking about the weather, talking about just spending time on the deck, looking at the stars and so on. I love that. As someone who was so clued into this useless thing, because heck, you could take a plane across the ocean much more efficiently, but they chose this older form of transportation that involved these sort of contemplative disciplines of studying and looking and waiting and so on. Develop a passion for useless things like that. As I mentioned, baseball. Sports is by its nature contemplative. That's what the Greeks understood. And we might see it more superficially, but they didn't see it superficially at all. It was a type of contemplation of the beautiful, Books, obviously, you and I are great bibliophiles. Read a good, deep, profound book that takes a long time to get through and to understand. You can't do that superficially.
Let's talk about another practice to adopt, and that is to turn our noisy devices, like our iPhones, into more single function or limited type devices. There's been a trend among all electronic devices to have more functions and be able to do more at one time. I'm thinking specifically of the Kindle devices. Originally a Kindle was just a device to read books. You could download books, you read a book. Now even Kindles have added apps and music and the internet browser and all this other stuff. So they're inviting you to go from your book to some other activity, making it harder to read. We talked, several months back about Digital Minimalism. It's a book by Cal Newport, and he posed the question, ask what tasks that you need your iPhone for example, and then ask yourself, are there simpler ways to accomplish this goal, either on my phone or through another device, that remove these distractions? So I don't know if it's like reading latest articles on the website that you keep checking multiple times every day. Can you instead set aside an hour once a week and then just catch up on that day? Is it really necessary to check it 10, 15 times a day? But I think a lot of people struggle with this, Bishop, with iPhones. It feels like there's a never-ending invitation to click this, try this, open this app, go to this website. You experience that. I know you do, don't you?
Sure. And the makers of all these things know just what they're doing. They know it's not that hard to get someone addicted to something. We're animals attuned to addiction, it seems to me. And they know how to do it. And you're right. You start looking at the iPhone, and before you know it, you're drawn into something like, why am I looking at this? Why am I spending time? My favorite example is just the Facebook feed. There's things coming up on Facebook, but you find yourself kind of scrolling through it.
And it's
then
endless. It never comes to an end. Facebook,
yes.
Twitter, Instagram, it's an endless feed.
Yes, and then you say, but wait a minute, why am I doing this? There's something too about screens. I don't know if it's the bright light, it's the colors. There's something about screens that draw us or addictive. We're like looking at the printed page of a book. That can be like, well, it's kind of drab. Give me some pictures and some color. Now again, I love pictures and color, but there's a danger, because if you're distracted away from things like books that require a lot more attention, whole worlds remain opaque to you. I found this, Brandon, in my years of teaching. So I taught at Mundelein from 92. I became rector in 2012. So on and off for about 20 years. I noticed it for sure in those 20 years, a certain decline in people's capacity to read a lengthy and complicated text. So when I first started teaching, you'd assign, I want you guys to read, these 75 pages of the Confessions for next time. I want you to read, this whole section of Plato's Republic. And then as the years went by, people would say, Father, I can't possibly read all that. I'm not going to spend all that much time.
Read these 2 paragraphs by next class, and then you'll be good.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute, it's too much. So I know that's the danger. And it's a discipline. And you've got to give it time. And, you've got to talk to people who know how to read books. Like something, I use all the time as a pen. So if I'm reading a book seriously, not something before I go to bed, I'll read like a novel or some history before I go to bed. But if I'm reading seriously, I always have a pen in my hand because it keeps me in the game. It's like keeping score at a baseball game. If you're keeping score, your mind's really in the game. So with the pen, I'm checking, questioning, what? I'm commenting on the book, or like, yeah, good. Or then an arrow, oh, that sounds like something else I just read. And, so that keeps me in the game. So there's disciplines you can use. But we've got to get better at that, I think.
When I came into the Catholic Church, one of the new practices for me was Eucharistic adoration. Never heard of it before, never practiced it before. But I know a lot of people in my generation, raised around noisy screens and notifications and news feeds and all that stuff, find Eucharistic adoration to be such a relief, because you walk into this room, no sound, no conversations, no quiet. There's a locus of attention. Everything's directed toward one thing, adoring the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. And especially if you commit to like an hour of adoration, you tell yourself, I'm locked in here. There's nothing else that's going to pull me away. I'm committed to this. That sort of like rewires and retrains your mind and makes it easy to contemplate elsewhere. What else does the Catholic spiritual tradition offer as an antidote to our distracted culture?
Oh, so much. Think of Lectio Divina, which is that very slow, prayerful way to read the Gospels or read any part of the Bible. Contemplative prayer. So Eucharistic adoration, I think, participates in that category of contemplative prayer. Think of meditation, an Ignatian-type meditation, where you spend the time to enter into the scene of a gospel story, and you look and you smell and you hear what it's like, and so on. All of those are contemplative practices. Or even something like, you go to the great medieval cathedrals and you find those labyrinths. And I've always loved that, because the labyrinth, let's say at Chartres, the most famous one, you enter, and I've walked it a couple times, and it takes you a long time. It's a big thing, and it's a winding path, kind of intestine-like. It winds back on itself, and and goes here, and you start here and you end up like there. You could walk there in like 10 or 5 steps, but you've just taken 25 minutes to get there in this sort of meandering way. Well, remember, the soul likes to go slow. It doesn't, boom, like to get there. It likes to go slow. So, I mean, all those are practices designed to overcome this sort of trivialization or divertissement approach and learn to look. You know, so much of prayer, even go beyond the Christian tradition here, go into the Eastern, like Buddhist traditions, is just to be awake to something, really awake to it. Here's a flower. Here's a river going by. To really see it. Do I see it? Watch it. Contemplate it over a long period of time. Those are all kind of soul calming moves.
If we could offer maybe one final recommendation at the risk of sounding a little self-referential, but the last episode we talked a lot about the Word on Fire Bible, and I think that text itself can be a major antidote to distraction because it pulls you in through the art and through the scriptural text. It's something you can sit with for a long while and meditate on and reflect on. So maybe if you want to start reading deeper books and longer reading sessions, maybe try it with the Word on Fire Bible, because in some ways it's made for that kind of deep contemplative reading.
That was behind that Bible in many ways, was this whole idea of how to draw someone into the Bible, especially distracted contemporary people. Here's the Bible with some little tiny footnotes at the bottom. That's probably not going to do it. But something that does grab their attention through the visual, but also lures them into a contemplative stance. That's very much behind what we were doing there.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. You can send in questions to the show by visiting askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question on any device. Today we have one coming from Gabriel in Massachusetts. He's asking about how to prove that there's a transcendent realm. Here's the way he puts it.
Hello, my name is Gabriel from Natick, Massachusetts. My question is a prerequisite to the question of God. How can we prove there is this other dimension, something we don't inhibit, and that we can't measure and scientifically or mathematically prove? Thank you.
Yeah, good. I mean, in many ways, that's the question of basic apologetics. But I'm going to take a clue from the question itself. Think about mathematics for a second. Mathematics. Plato understood this. It's still true. When you move into a properly mathematical realm, you're not looking at 7 items in front of you. You're contemplating the number 7. You're not looking at a triangularly shaped figure in front of you. You're thinking now about a triangle or about a circle. Not a circular shape that you can see like that camera lens, but circularity, a circle in the geometrical sense. You have stepped out of the sensible world because points and circles and lines and triangles in the abstract sense are not visual items. They are pure abstractions. They are, if you want, invisible realities. Now, press it a little further. You mentioned both math and science. All of science rests upon objective intelligibility, right? There has to be some kind of formal structure to reality, or the sciences cannot get off the ground. Therefore, something like ordered harmonies necessarily structure a scientific approach to life. Press it further, especially contemporary science. Read Einstein and the quantum theorists and all those people. It is inextricably tied to mathematics. You can't do high science, especially today, without desperately abstract mathematics. Therefore, science, we say, that most orders me to the sensible world. Well, yes, in a way, but you can't analyze the sensible world scientifically without mathematics. Mathematics is in itself invisible. It's a non-sensible reality. I think of my nephew, who's at MIT and doing all this high science, and he's going to be, building and designing robotics and all this business. Terrific. It's about the sensible world, but he cannot begin to do that work without being very comfortable in the invisible world. That's why mathematics actually is one of those doors that opens to what I would call, and I think you're hinting at it, a transcendent world. See, I'm just a bitter opponent of this reductive materialism and scientism, which is compromising the souls of people today. And I just want them to say, even as they hold up science, which they should, I hold it up too. We love science. We love science. But to say science is to say math. To say math is to say the invisible. And so don't play this game of, oh, these poor old religious people with their crazy, wacky ideas about a higher world. If you're doing science, you are in the higher world that I'm talking about. You've at least walked through into the vestibule of the world that I'm talking about. So I would turn that on its head, that objection. It's precisely math and science that orders you to a transcendent world. Okay, end of rant on that subject.
Well, as we work to get Bishop Barron's blood pressure back down to normal levels, I wanted to mention one final time to pick up your copy of the Word on Fire Bible. We talked about it during the whole episode last week. It just came out last week on June 15th. But you can find it at wordonfire.org/Bible. We have 3 beautiful versions, a paperback version, a hardcover version, and then the leather version. If you have young sons or daughters or college students or just people in your life that haven't read the Bible, aren't familiar with the Bible, don't like religion, this is the book you can pass them to lure them back in, to become re-enchanted with the religious world of the Bible. So check it out at wordonfire.org/Bible. Well, thanks again for listening and watching. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.
Welcome everybody, I'm Matt Nelson, the Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm here live on location in the examination schools at Oxford University in Oxford, England, and I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. In just a few moments, I'm going to be asking Bishop Barron questions submitted from our Word on Fire Institute members about the life, thought, and ministry of St. John Henry Newman. But first, I want to invite you, if you're not a Word on Fire Institute member, to go to wordonfire.institute and sign up right now. When you become a member of the Institute, you'll have access to courses from top experts on disciplines like theology, philosophy, sociology, apologetics, evangelization, literature, and other fields of expertise. But most importantly, you'll have access to Bishop Barron's brand new 12-lesson course on St. John Henry Newman. So go to wordonfire.institute and sign up now. And with that, let's jump into questions. Bishop Barron, how are you today?
I'm good. Great to be with you, Matt.
Good. So the first question I want to ask you is just about your experience just a couple days ago. You were in Rome for the canonization of now St. John Henry Newman. What was that like for you?
It was a thrill, right there in St. Peter's Square, and I've admired Newman for so many years. When I used to teach courses of Newman, I would tell the students, now mark my words, he'll be a saint one day and a doctor of the church. So I kept thinking during the Mass, well, we're halfway there. Newman's now a saint. I was struck too by just all the historical and spiritual resonances in that place. There's the successor of Peter celebrating the Mass. We're right near the grave of St. Peter. We chanted the gospel that day in Latin and Greek, and I thought how Newman would have loved that because it evoked the church fathers. So all those wonderful resonances. And then during the Mass, I was right up in the front there near the altar, and looking up on the facade of the basilica was this magnificent tapestry of John Henry Newman. And I just kept thinking, boy, did he ever in his wildest imaginings think, when he arrived in Rome as a middle-aged man in about 1846, that he'd be declared a saint of the Catholic Church. And it just struck me over and over again, the wonderful kind of ironies and connections and resonances. So it was a beautiful day.
Yeah, I caught some of it, and it was a beautiful Mass. It was really moving to see all 5 of the new saints canonized that day, and so really exciting. And so now we're here in Oxford. You've been here before, and you know, this was an exciting thing for the Word on Fire Institute members because they got to contribute to this very event that we're engaging in right now. They submitted questions that they wanted you to address while we're here, and so based on those questions, I've got those here for you today, some questions that I put together. So the first question that I want to ask you, and I think this is fitting with us sitting here in the oldest English-speaking university in the world, maybe even the most renowned university in the world, to ask you, what did St. John Henry Newman have to say about universities?
Yeah, first you're right in suggesting that this is Newman's town in many ways. He was an Oxford man. It defined him his whole life long. Even after he became a Catholic and left his formal teaching and fellowship here, he remained an Oxford man. It was in his blood and his bones. And of course, he writes the magnificent Idea of a University, one of his great texts, still of enormous influence today. I think what Newman saw, so many things, but one is the importance of a truly liberal education. So we're obsessed, especially now, with practicality, with mechanics, with how to get things done, to be practical. Even our higher disciplines, think of engineering and so on, are usually geared toward something pragmatic. Newman insisted upon the value of a properly liberal education, liberal from the word in Latin for free, and that means free of practicality. In other words, something which is not subordinated to a good outside of itself, but is sought for its own sake. So that's Aristotle's famous definition, that the liberal sciences are those that are the highest because they're good in themselves. Just like playing baseball is something liberal, meaning you don't do it for some other purpose, you do it because it's good. Well, philosophy is like that. And Newman felt that the purpose of a university ultimately is to produce the philosophical habit. So studying all the various disciplines, yes, but the overall purpose was to give this sort of universal view of things, the interrelationship among the various disciplines, and to see them as good in themselves, as beautiful and valuable in themselves. And that, I think, remains to this day an extremely important and valuable contribution.
What did St. John Henry Newman, that sounds good, what did he have to say about the university in terms of helping somebody become a gentleman? That was the word he used when he talked about the purpose of a liberal arts education and developing this philosophical habit.
Yeah, and that's it. That's shorthand for what I was just describing. The person that has the philosophical habitus would be a gentleman. And as an Englishman, he rated gentlemanliness as a very high level. But the interesting thing is Newman said, that's the purpose of a university. The purpose of the church is to make not the gentleman, but the saint. And he defined the saint really over and against the gentleman in some ways. Gentlemen, he said, make you feel comfortable and at ease. They're like a fine fire or a comfortable chair. Saints, last time I checked and last time he checked, were often anything but comfortable figures. They were edgy and challenging and disturbing figures. Think of everyone from Jeremiah the prophet through Jerome and Francis of Assisi and in our time Mother Teresa. They're not really comfortable figures. So that was an important distinction. Yes, the university, which inculcates the philosophical habit, produces gentlemen, but the church is meant to produce something else, namely the saint.
So could we see a university as a sort of precursor to then the church, in the sense that becoming a gentleman or becoming gentlemanly is in a way preparing somebody but not getting them the whole way to being holy?
Yeah, there's something of the nature-grace distinction there. So Newman affirmed being a gentleman. He wasn't against it at all, on the contrary. But being a saint was something beyond it. So it's not eschewing nature or denigrating it, but then also insisting there's something more than that. So that was the tension built into those essays on the university. He loved the university, loved what it was about, loved what it was meant to produce. But he didn't want to reduce sanctity to being a gentleman. He didn't want to reduce the purpose of the church to the purpose of a university. So he kept, I would say, a healthy tension between nature and grace.
Good. Let's stick with this conversation about the university for another question. I'm interested to know, do you think that St. John Henry Newman would have thought that theology belonged in even the secular universities? And how do you personally feel about that?
No, he clearly did. And by theology there, he wouldn't have meant so much the formal theology of the church. He would have meant what they called in those days natural theology. So theology based upon reason, philosophical reason. And Newman felt, if it's a university, that means it has to include all the disciplines. Why wouldn't you include the discipline that speaks of God, because God impinges upon all things. Is God operative in history? Yes, obviously. Does God inspire much of the literature of the world? Obviously. Is God implicated in the sciences? Well, sure, in the measure that all the sciences depend upon the intelligibility of the world, which in turn is a result of creation, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so how could you be a university in good faith if you didn't have a discipline dedicated to that which impinges upon everything else? Furthermore, and I think it's a very important part of his argument, is theology belongs in the center of the university disciplines. And there Newman echoes someone like Bonaventure in the Middle Ages. When you extricate theology from the position in the center, nature pours a vacuum. Something else will move into that central position. And Newman saw that very clearly mid-19th century. Do we see it today? I would say in spades, precisely in the scientism that dominates our intellectual life. What's moved into the center of all the disciplines but science? I can't tell you how many times in my work, on the internet, people will say some version of, well, science is what you mean by reason. To be reasonable is to be scientific, right? And I say, well, wrong. Science is indeed a form of reasonability, but not the only one. And what's happened there is the supplanted theology has now been replaced by science. When I was coming of age, psychology maybe had that central, all-defining position. Beware, said Newman in the mid-19th century, when that happens, you'll have a distortion of all the disciplines. When theology is, as the Middle Ages saw it, the Regina Scientiarum, right? It was the queen of the sciences.
Right.
When it was in the properly central position, the other sciences maintained their integrity. I think that observation remains enormously important today.
In your course on St. John Henry Newman, you talk about this, you go into greater depth. And as I was contemplating what you teach in that course and then thinking about the questions I'd be asking you today, as I was thinking about theology in the secular university, I thought of a comment once made by Paul Davies. He's a renowned physicist and he's an agnostic. But he commented once on modern science and the advancements in science, what it now tells us almost forces us now into a sort of theological position. And so that's another thing I think to consider when we talk about theology in the secular university.
Wasn't he the one, in fact, who challenged his scientific colleagues? Where do the laws of nature come from? So, all of science rests upon this fundamental assumption of intelligibility, and we put that in terms of the laws of science. Call them even patterns of probability if you want, but all of science rests upon that. And wasn't it he who, in a famous article, challenged his colleagues to say, okay, where'd that come from?
He has, I'm not sure, but he has been a voice in the scientific community that has challenged his colleagues. And as an agnostic, he's written a couple books and has
Right,
won
that
some
he is indeed
awards.
an agnostic, but that he thought that was a fair question to tease out.
Yeah.
Like, all right, well, then give me your best account of it.
Yeah.
Why should the world be structured in such a way that it corresponds to the most complex type of mathematics? Look at the highest level physics, always involves very complex mathematics. Why should it be the case that reality is describable in that way?
Yeah.
Well, we would say the intelligibility of the world is grounded in something like an intelligence that has thought it into being. So that every act of science, as Ratzinger once said, is a recognitio, right? It's a recognition. It's a rethinking of what's already been thought. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah.
And why I think something like theology, or call it natural theology, belongs in the circle of university disciplines.
Yeah, and something that he's doing that I think Newman would have respected is the fact that he sees that faith and reason have a sort of compatibility between the two. And so he's agnostic, but he's not resting easily in agnosticism. He's open to the conversation.
And that's a salutary thing today, when you've got a lot of the scientistic point of view. The new atheists are dripping with scientism, and they'll play that card over and over again, but it's such a self-refuting card in a way, because the sciences can't explain their own ground. They can't articulate on their own terms the ground upon which they stand.
Right.
You need a higher discipline to do that. The classical authors understood that, and we go back to Aristotle, understood that. Aquinas would have understood that. Newman understood it, and that's something needed today.
Yeah, we could keep going on that topic for a long time, but I know this is a question that our Word on Fire Institute members will be waiting for, and that's basically for book recommendations. Now, let's talk about Newman's books for a moment. 2 questions. One is, what do you think, objectively speaking, is the most important book that Newman wrote for us today? The second part of the question is, for you personally, what's been the most significant book he wrote for you?
Yeah, your first question, I guess I would say The Grammar of Assent, that magnificent late career masterpiece of Newman's that's full of so many important distinctions and clarifications and insights. The fact that Bernard Lonergan, who wrote his great book, Insight, in the mid-20th century, said he read Newman's grammar something like 12 times before he sat down to write Insight, you know. I think what we're getting from the grammar, the importance of probability rather than certitude as the best epistemic guide. And here's what I mean. Now you can trace some of this back to people like Plato, but in the modern period, Descartes bequeathed to the West, I would say, a certain obsession with certitude, you know? How can you be certain of something? And so Descartes, as we know, famously doubts all that can be doubted. Coming up finally with the cogito, the one thing you can't doubt is that you're a doubter. So I think, therefore I am. But now, watch all the great modern thinkers that follow him. They're too obsessed with this question of certitude. Newman said the grammar came from an insight. Namely, don't start with certitude. Start with assent. Why do we give assent to propositions? We say, yes, that's true. Now, why do we do that? And Newman said, we hardly ever do it because we have apodictic inferential support for it. So I assent to that because I've got an absolutely convincing argument that no one could deny. That's hardly ever the case. Rather, as he famously says, it's typically from a whole congeries of arguments indeed, but also, you know, insights and hunches and examples and experiences that all converge to the same place. And that leads me, by this inner sense he called the illative sense, it leads me to say, finally, yes, that's true. You know, his famous example being, how do you know Great Britain's an island? We don't have an apodictic, syllogistic argument to come to that conclusion, but it's based, as he says, on all sorts of insights, examples, histories, your own personal experience, all coming together around the conclusion that Great Britain's an island. That's the way the mind typically functions. And see, I like that a lot. It gets you out of the Cartesian obsession with certitude and aligns you more toward understanding. You know, come into a deeper understanding of things by a process both intellectual and experiential, emotional, etc. I think that epistemic move is of extraordinary importance for our own time.
I want to get back to the grammar of assent.
Well, who doesn't want to get back to it?
Well, maybe we need to read it 14 times before we can really have a conversation about it, like Lonergan. But let's, before we go back to that book, talk a little bit about your personal choice, which has been most significant for you.
Well, for me, it's the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. It's his autobiography. And the reason for that is when I was a kid at the University of Notre Dame, and I was just thinking about the priesthood at that point. And I met with this wonderful priest, Father Tom McNally, still alive in his mid-90s now. And we were talking away, and he sensed that I had intellectual interests. He said, I think a book you should read is John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and he described it as his autobiography. Well, I had heard of neither Newman nor the book at that point, but I went to the Notre Dame bookstore, and I found it. And I still have it. I bought this little red-covered paperback, about this big. Now it's all wrinkled and dog-eared. I think I glanced at it when I was 18, and it meant so little to me. I didn't really understand it, and I put it aside. But many years later, I came back to that book. And as you know, it's Newman sort of telling of the story of his conversion, how he moves, you know, from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. But there's something so compelling about that story, and so rich, and so beautifully told. It's being written around the same time as Dickens's novels and all that. And it came out the same way Dickens' novels came out, like in installations. And people would stand in line to wait for the next installment, you know, of the Apologia. It's had that impact on me as I've read it over the years, as I've taught it. Newman's story, it's a bit like Augustine's story, that his own life becomes a template that a lot of people follow and fit their own lives into. So that book has meant a lot to me, and as I say, that little red paperback, I still have it. How many years later is that? 40 some years later.
Yeah.
And it means a lot to me.
And that book was autobiographical, but it was a defense.
Yeah,
and
apologia.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, he was accused by a fellow named Charles Kingsley, who was an Anglican controversialist at the time, and he accused Newman of being indifferent to the truth, and it was based on an earlier sermon that Newman. Well, that was like waving a red, cape before a bull. I mean, because Newman was dedicated, hyper dedicated to the truth. But he answered Kingsley. Kingsley answered back, and Newman thought, okay, to answer this sufficiently, I need to tell my whole story.
Right.
And so the book comes out of that experience.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that that it's being written with that kind of a tone of answering somebody who has challenged him, gives the book a really interesting feel when you're reading through it.
And see, Newman was not so much a pure intellectual, meaning someone that looked at ideas for their own sake. He was always a controversialist, and I think he would have embraced that description more than theologian. He often said, I'm not a theologian. I'm not like Augustine or Aquinas.
Yeah.
He was more of an apologist or a controversialist, more of an intellectual kind of street fighter, meaning he was always engaged with someone. And I think his purpose was to bring people to conversion. He himself had undergone this conversion, and he wanted everyone else to as well. He wanted to bring people to what he felt was the fullness of the faith.
Yeah.
So there was always kind of a fighting edge. And man, was he a good satirist, and he had a bit of a poison pen. I mean, if you got on Newman's wrong side, he'll let you have it, literarily speaking.
Right. Yeah. No. But yet there's always a tone of charity, even though he's at times in a sort of appropriate and balanced way coming on strong.
Yeah, he's polemical.
Yeah.
But so was Augustine, so was Jerome, so was Chrysostom. Read most of the fathers. I mean, they're very polemical.
And compelling.
I think he would have gotten it from them more than from his own time. He would have gotten it from reading the church fathers.
Yeah, well, when we were talking about key influencers in his conversion, who did you say were the key influencers for his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism?
I would say the fathers. Yeah. And it's not, and there were some people in his own time, some Catholics that he was reading. But I would say the prime influence were the church fathers. His area of great interest was the controversies of the 4th century. And it was this study of those controversies that led him finally to say, I see a disturbing analogy between the Anglicanism of my own time and the heretical positions of the ancient world. And so I think it was a careful reading of the fathers that led him finally to his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah. Well, let's jump back now to the grammar of assent, because what I'd like you to do for our viewers is, could you draw the distinction between real and notional assent? Those are two terms that Newman discusses a lot in that book, and I think they're very applicable to our time now. Can you talk about, number one, what he meant by those terms, but also then, in your method of evangelization, which usually involves beauty as the arrowhead of the whole program, talk about how Newman's thought on real and notional assent ultimately leads then to your strategy for evangelization today. Yeah.
The distinction really is a simple one. A notional assent is one that I give to an abstraction or a proposition, an idea. Mm-hmm. And Newman loved propositions and abstractions and ideas, and he realized that notional assent always has a role to play in our coming to know things correctly. So that's the first type. But it's sharply to be distinguished from real assent, which is the assent I give to particulars, to this experience, to this image. It's always correlated to something very factual in front of me, nuts and bolts. And see, there I would see the influence of another important Oxford figure, namely Duns Scotus. Go right back to the Middle Ages. Duns Scotus felt that the epistemology he inherited from the classical world and that Thomas Aquinas represented was still way too abstract. And so Scotus has this idea of haixeitas, which is particularity. He coined that term. It means thisness. So I can abstract the form of glass from this object. But he thought the mind didn't want just that. It wanted, what's this thing, this particular, what's the hexeitas, the form of particularity? There's a lot of that in Newman, I think. And that corresponds to what he called real assent. Now, both are involved in the process of coming to know. He did not have a contempt for the first, and it wasn't a simple-minded distinction. But he did feel that it's real assent that moves us to action. That if you want to move people to change, to do something, you'd appeal more to the real than to the notional. We had the privilege today of going out to Blenheim Palace and visiting the tomb of Churchill, and I always felt Churchill got this in his bones. I mean, Churchill was someone obviously who knew how to use propositions and ideas, but when Churchill wanted to move this country to action, all I've got to give you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We're going to fight on the beaches, we're going to fight on the landing grounds, we're going to fight, with increasing strength in the air, we're going to fight. And notice there, Newman would have appreciated this. He's using very Anglo-Saxon words there. Because in English, we have that wonderful confluence of two streams. There's the more Latinate stream that came from French, and then there's the more Anglo-Saxon stream. And we associate the Latinate words with propositions, the Anglo-Saxon words with the real, right? So Churchill was giving us blood, toil, tears, sweat, fight, beaches. It's all Anglo-Saxon words. Real assent language moves people to action. So Newman wanted to move people to action. Why? Because he was a Catholic apologist. He wanted to bring people to the Catholic faith, to undergo a conversion. And therefore you needed, he thought, primarily real assent to make that happen.
So talk a little bit then about, before we get into the beauty portion of the question, talk about now illative sense and the illative sense and how that applies to these ideas.
Well, the illative sense is the epistemic correlate to something like conscience.
Okay.
So, conscience is able to assess the situation and take things in and then say, this is the direction I should go in, morally speaking. Think of like prudence, Now put it in the epistemic context. As I assess this hunch, this insight, this experience, this idea, this argument, this witness, and I assess all of it, and I see them all converging at one point. It's the illative sense, Newman felt, that leads me to assent, that says, yes, it brings together, it assesses, it correlates all of these influences, and then moves the mind to assent. So it's a sensibility.
Okay.
Would
you say that the illative sense in a way brings together the notional and the real?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. It would help to bring all of it together. And that's the way, here's where the rubber meets the road, because that's how we, in fact, 99% of the time, make decisions. Why we say, yes, that's true. We can hardly ever say, oh, let me show you the argument. Premise A, premise B, conclusion. Got it? That's why we hardly ever operate that way. That might be part of it. There might be an argument I could conjure up. But usually it's by this whole complex process. And the illative sense is that feel. It's like when people ask me, how come you became a priest? Well, I can never give an answer.
Right.
Or someone saying, how come you married your wife? You can't just come up with, well, here's major premise, minor premise, conclusion.
Yeah.
There's a whole variety, in my case of becoming a priest, of reasons why. The illative sense, is what assesses all of that and leads me to say, yes, I'm going to make this change in my life and become a priest. Or in your case, I'm going to marry this woman. And I think Newman had great psychological insight. He was not a in the clouds philosopher when it came to the act of knowing. He was a psychologically perceptive man.
So, Newman was interested not just in saying yes, but then acting upon that yes. And you talk about how beauty has this power to move us into action, essentially.
Yeah.
So then what's the relationship between how beauty acts on us and how we experience real ascent?
Yeah, well, that's a good example of it. It's because, I can be, let's say, moving in the direction of believing in God, but then I walk into Chartres Cathedral, and I see the rose window, and I see that place, and it has that weird, almost alchemical influence on me. It starts changing me, I think of the famous Cardinal Lustiger, who was Archbishop of Paris when I was a student there many years ago. A Jew, his mother died in the Shoah, and he was sent to a Catholic family for kind of safekeeping during the Holocaust. And he wanders one day into one of the great Gothic cathedrals, and that changed him. Or the famous example of Paul Claudel, the great French playwright,
Right.
standing in I know exactly where it was, at Notre Dame in Paris, looking up at the rose window, and that's when it came together. It was the beautiful that, and to use Newman's language now, I think prompted this real assent to the proposition that God is real, God exists. My life has to change. And I'm sure both Lustiger and Claudel knew arguments, and I wouldn't discount for a minute that they played a role. I think in my own life, an argument for God's existence when I was a kid played a big role in moving me to a deeper appreciation of religion. But I would never say, oh, that's it. It's this argument. That's why, no, it was the beginning of a process. It was a magnet around which a lot of things gathered, But I think Newman is especially sensitive to the complexity of this psychological and epistemic process by which we come to assent.
Yeah, and he had a real gift for seeing the complexity, but then writing in a really engaging way, as profound and sometimes as careful as you have to be reading him. Theologically speaking, he's had great influence, and you talk about his influence at the Second Vatican Council. The ironic thing is, he was dead by the time the Second Vatican Council came around.
Right, but I've said he's maybe the most important dead person at Vatican II. So there were a lot of important players at the council, the periti, the theological experts. But among the heavenly players, I'd put Newman near the front rank, because think of so many of the periti at Vatican II, de Lubac and Bouillet and Danielu and Ratzinger. Balthasar wasn't there, but he was very influenced by Newman. All these people carried a very Newman-esque influence. You know what it was, Matt, I think? It was the importance of the church fathers. Newman is a proto-Nouvelle Théologie figure in this way. The Nouvelle Théologie figures, mid-20th century, tended to leap over the Middle Ages and the Reformation and those debates, and they went back on purpose to the church fathers. And they found a time when Christianity was united. So before the great splits, whether it's the 1054 split or the 1517 split, they went back before those. And they found this sort of compelling Christian space of the church fathers. Well, who anticipated all that? 100 years before the Nouvelle Théologie, John Henry Newman. He had nothing but respect for Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic method are conspicuous by their absence in Newman. What do you find in Newman instead? The fathers, the fathers, the fathers. And I think that's what influenced your de Lubacs and Bouillets and Balthasars and Ratzingers. And they, in turn, massively influenced the Vatican Council. Thomas, again, I have nothing but reverence for Thomas myself, but he's also relatively absent from the Vatican II documents. But they are redolent of the church fathers. That's very much of a Newman impact, I think, at Vatican II. But he's certainly a major player.
What was it that John Tracy Ellis said about Newman that really caught your attention?
This was many years ago. I was a first-year philosophy student at Catholic University. I was getting my master's degree, my first year in the master's program. And I was at theological college, and to our house for daily mass this one night came the famous John Tracy Ellis, who at the time was about 80 maybe, and he was generally regarded as the dean of American Catholic Church historians. He was the great figure. Wrote the great biography of Cardinal Gibbons. He was Cardinal Dolan's thesis director. Oh, really? So a very major player, And he gave this wonderful, it was atypical at the time, believe me, but this wonderful classic stem winding sort of sermon. in the course of which he said, as a kind of, obiter dictum, he said, John Henry Newman, the greatest Catholic theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And I was a kid, and I knew Newman from Father Tom McNally telling me about this book, but I knew almost nothing about him. But I tucked that away. I thought, wow, this very weighty figure has just said that the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas is John Henry Newman. And I tucked that away thinking, boy, I've got to read this fellow someday with greater care, which I did. But Ellis played a role in my own, appreciation of Newman.
It's been interesting to see how St. John Henry Newman and St. Thomas Aquinas have both influenced you.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know, maybe in a way it's reminiscent of Herbert McCabe, who many people called a Thomist, but himself didn't like that label, and he was influenced by so many different people.
But McCabe is I think, a wonderful Thomist.
Yeah.
But reads Thomas in a very fresh way.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say both Aquinas and Newman have influenced me, even though Newman, as I say, wasn't really very Thomist and didn't have a lot in common with Thomas, but for me, they're very complementary figures. I say, the great Catholic both and is on display there. Bring them both on,
Sure.
I like both Newman and Thomas.
Yeah, you've kind of been a master of finding the best of what everybody has to offer and then making something of that. And I think that really is something for all of us to learn in this time, in this culture, when we're setting out to evangelize, do apologetics. There's so much to learn about this from so many different angles, so many different influencers.
Right. Well, I've always hated that. I'm glad you bring that up, because I've always hated that way of reading the tradition. As though there's one voice who's just got it right, and then with everybody else, all I'm going to do is notice how they disagree with the one voice I think is really right. It's such an ungenerous and finally un-Catholic way to read. And I'll take as Exhibit A, Thomas Aquinas himself. How did he read the great intellectual tradition? With a tremendous generosity of spirit. Thomas wasn't dwelling on the mistakes of those that came before him. On the contrary, he tends to say, here's what's wonderful in Aristotle, here's what's wonderful in Plato, here's what's really worthwhile in Cicero. Here, by the way, is what's really worthwhile in Moses Maimonides, my rabbi, colleague intellectually. Yeah. Here's what's really interesting and important in Averroes and Avicenna and Avicebron, my Islamic colleagues. Did he disagree with all those people? Yes, very clearly. But it's a generous way of reading the intellectual tradition. What I don't like is that sort of cramped, defensive, very un-Catholic way to read the tradition, whereby I choose one figure who is he's it, that's the person, and everyone else I'm going to snipe at them and show how wrong they are. Where's that get us? I would say, why not benefit from all these great figures? Yeah. Look, I'm a Thomist. I disagree with key elements in Duns Scotus, but I just sang the praises of Duns Scotus 20 minutes ago because I think there are wonderful things in Duns Scotus. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that's a sort of meta point, but don't read the Catholic tradition in that cramped, defensive way. It doesn't help. Read it as generously as Aquinas did.
And be open to anywhere you hear the truth.
And that's what Thomas said. Yeah. Wherever the truth is found, God has spoken there. Thomas says that. So you hear the truth from an Islamic scholar. Good. God's spoken there. And who would ever accuse of Thomas Aquinas of being somehow a religious relativist? But he had that generous way of approaching the intellectual tradition.
And Newman was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And even with Darwin's thought, Newman wasn't outright opposed to what Darwin had to say. What did Newman say about Darwin's theory of evolution? Was he open to that?
Well, he was, and rather unusually for the time, he was a Christian who said, I don't think this poses any sort of threat to authentic Catholic orthodoxy. And there were Christians who were deeply concerned about Darwin. I think Newman was very much ahead of his time. He was also very interested in mathematics and the sciences. And I think that's very hopeful. I'd also say this about Newman and Darwin. As you say, writing right around the same time. They were both part of this Lebensphilosophie movement. So think of a figure like Hegel in Germany. Lebensphilosophie means philosophy of life, or life philosophy. The stress was on how things develop and unfold, and how how events and ideas and so on are alive across history. They're not simply statically given, right?
Right.
So much of classical philosophy is predicated upon the assumption that you've got static essences and forms that are simply given. Now, Newman didn't deny essences and forms, but he tended to see how they unfold themselves across space and time. So think of Newman's essay on the development of doctrine as a kind of parallel text in a way to The Origin of Species. So Darwin showing how species, in fact, unfold over space and time. So ideas unfold over space and time. Mm-hmm. Controversial at its time? Yeah, it sure was, Newman's theory. Generally accepted at Vatican II? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Something I find intriguing is that Vatican II itself is a sort of ratification of Newman's theory. What do you find at Vatican II when you read those documents carefully is not a repudiation of anything that came before, but rather a development of doctrine. Mm-hmm. How can you read Lumen Gentium, for example, and not see real development in regard to ecclesiology? How can you read Dignitatis Humanae and not see development in regard to the kind of church-state relationship question? Newman insisted every legitimate development has a conservative action upon its past. So he's no relativist. He's not in favor of radical ruptures. But development, you bet. And Vatican II, by its very nature in a way, ratifies that point of view. That brings him close to Darwin, it seems to me, in sort of a Lebensphilosophie context.
So then, on that topic of interacting with people who we would not perhaps agree much with, who we wouldn't hold faith in common with, interacting with non-believers, today in the world of popular apologetics, I mean, the popular arguments are usually cosmological arguments or design arguments, which are great. They have a place. But Newman took a unique approach because he began with the conscience, didn't he, when it came to the existence of God?
Yeah, and he knew, of course, the tradition of the more cosmological arguments. Mm-hmm. He knew in his own time, Paley, who proposed the famous, watchmaker. Right. It's kind of a design argument. Mm-hmm. Newman was very impatient with those. He didn't exactly repudiate them, but he was impatient with them. One reason is they dealt so much at the notional level, and he felt that they wouldn't move people to real change. Mm-hmm. And also, relatedly, they didn't come to the particularity of the God of the Bible. Now, what did? He searched for a real access to God. Is there a possibility of giving real assent? And his answer was, yeah, through conscience. Because the conscience gives me, he felt, a vivid, visceral experience of a moral judge. Someone, that's why we speak of the voice of the conscience, as opposed to like my aesthetic sensibility, let's say, or even like the illative sense. But conscience, we say, it's the voice. I heard the voice of my conscience. Now, why? Because it puts us in the presence, he felt, of a judge who sees my interior life and determines that, you're acting rightly or wrongly. What does it give me? Not just a sense of, some distant first cause, but of a living person who's present to me in the sort of intimacy of my interior life, who is a moral judge, who rewards and punishes, who is of providential import. Mm-hmm. All of that, Newman felt, brought you much more in line with a biblical understanding of God. And it made the experience of God unavoidable, and it pushed you to action. So his approach to apologetics is precisely that. Begin with the conscience, and you'll get to the biblical idea of God.
Good. Well, apologetics, properly understood, is part of our task of increasing Christian unity throughout the world. And I wish we could sit here for another hour and go through so many more questions, because there were so many more good questions.
We're out of questions? Or
we got one more left for today. So I'm going to go right to the last question I wanted to ask you before we wrap this up. And that is, what does St. John Henry Newman have to teach us, especially Catholics and Anglicans, about moving towards greater unity among us?
It's a good question, and there's a number of ways to answer it. What comes to my mind, though, is this, especially today. The distinctions and fights among ourselves maybe aren't as important as our common fight against a common enemy. And what I mean is, all biblical people, all people of faith, are standing against right now a very aggressive secularism. Denies the existence of God, denies the existence of objective moral values, denies much of the classical, biblical view of things. Anglicans and Catholics could sort of fight and fuss about what still divides us, or we could make common cause as biblical people and say we got to enter into the lists against this very aggressive secularism. And that might be a way to find real unity in a common shared battle. Something I often say in ecumenical conversations when I have them now is that, look, we could fight about the 16th century till the cows come home. We've been doing it for 500 years. Or we can make common cause, And I think that might be an instinct that Newman would have had.
And we've made some advances. I mean, especially with the Church of England and over the years.
Oh, indeed. No, quite right. And we could explore that line. You're quite right. But I just wonder, it might be the best way to find real unity today is make common cause against this, rather threatening enemy.
Well, thanks so much, Bishop Barron. I wish we could go through more questions. We've definitely got more questions to look at, but maybe for a future time.
Love it.
So for all of you watching, go to wordonfire.institute. Join the Word on Fire Institute, where you can become a member and take in Bishop Barron's brand new course. Go to wordonfire.institute. We'd love to have you aboard. And Bishop Barron, would you want to give us some last words and maybe a final blessing?
Sure. The last word would just be gratitude, Matt, to you and to all the viewers. I'm so happy Newman now canonized. We pray to Newman, and I hope this canonization draws greater attention to him and to his writings. I think he remains for people today very much of a pivotal player, so I'm pleased about that. And let me give a final blessing to our viewers. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen. It's a favorite technique of those trained in the Derridean deconstructionist method to find a loose thread, an anomaly, a contradiction, an unresolved tension in even the most venerable philosophical weave, and then to pull on it until the fabric comes undone. A prime example of this is the way a number of postmodern thinkers, including Jacques Derrida himself, tugged at the thread of what they call the aporia of the gift, in order to problematize certain claims of the religious traditions. What I want to do in this paper is to turn the tables a bit on the postmoderns, pulling the loose thread of their very characterization of the aporia of the gift. For it's my contention that their analysis of the anomalies within the idea of giftedness actually serves to clarify what stands distinctively at the heart of the Christian spiritual and philosophical tradition. As is only fitting, as I make my remarks in this august place dedicated to St. Thomas Aquinas, I'll use the text of the Angelic Doctor to make my argument. So first of all, what does this mean, the aporia of the gift? The postmodern preoccupation with the theme of the gift finds its roots in the sociological work of the French thinker Marcel Mauss. In his studies of primal peoples, Mauss uncovered the dynamics of an economy of exchange, whereby the giving of a gift by one tribal chief would prompt in his rival an answering gift, lest the latter be shamed by the former. Émile Benveniste engaged in similar research, which revealed that in some cultures, one act of hospitality would awaken in the one who received it an act of even more extravagant hospitality, which would in turn compel the original giver to give even more generously until the two communities essentially ruined one another through a kind of mutual shaming. This is why Benveniste could playfully suggest an etymological link between hospitality and hostis, enemy in Latin. In texts such as Given Time and Aporias, Derrida elaborates upon this phenomenon in a more strictly philosophical vein. It appears, he says, that the first condition of the authentic gift is that it's offered without consideration of compensation. Were strings attached to a present that I have made, one would be hard-pressed to refer to it as a true gift. Indeed, were I to receive such a present, I would feel not so much gratified and grateful, but manipulated. Even a gift as seemingly uncomplicated as a birthday present from a relative carries with it the at least implicit obligation of writing a thank you note as compensation. Anyone who's ever had the exquisitely awkward experience of confronting a person who plaintively and resentfully observes, "I hope you received the gift I gave you," feels the force of this demand. The second fundamental condition for the possibility of gift is presence. That is to say, the appearance of the gift qua gift. If some boon appeared simply out of the blue, with no indication as to its provenance, one might consider it luck or good fortune, but one would hardly be tempted to call it a gift, except in the most blandly metaphorical sense. It's intriguing here to note the close relationship in English between the terms gift and present. Now, once we acknowledge these two indispensable conditions, Derrida argues, it's difficult to see how a true gift is even possible. For the moment something appears qua gift, it would seem necessarily to awaken in the recipient the need to reciprocate. And this would poison the water, so to speak. Precisely as a present, a gift can never be free, and in order to be free, it can't be present. On this score, Derrida rejoices in the rather delicious link between the English word gift and the German Gift, designating poison. Finally, any gift is noxious for both giver and receiver, it seems, since it locks both into a mutually destructive economy of exchange. Now, the full exploration of this motif in the postmoderns would take us way too far afield, but for our purposes today, it might be worthwhile to note some troubling implications for the classical Christian tradition, for which the notions of gift and grace are so obviously crucial. It's elemental for Christian philosophy and theology, for example, that creation itself be construed as a sheer gift of God, that the Holy Spirit is aptly named donum Dei, that the moral life consists in the gift of self, and perhaps most problematically from the Derridean perspective, that worship is an act of thanksgiving, an obligation to return to God what God has given. That Derrida himself was aware of the aporia, or anomaly of the gift, that it poses problems for Christianity, is made manifest in his insistence that the only kind of messianism that's viable is a messianism without a Messiah. That is to say, an expectation of a divine gift that never really arrives. His famous characterization of deconstruction is the attitude of viens, oui, come, yes, yes, is conditioned by the assurance that the definitive other, the final answer to the longing, never actually comes. Now, here's my argument. Far from undermining central claims of Christianity, the Derridean dilemma provides, in fact, a route of access to understanding the central Christian mystery more fully. It serves, if you will, as the grit in the oyster around which the pearl can form, and Thomas Aquinas especially helps us to see this. The term gift, donum, and its variants appears 1,756 times in the writings of St. Thomas. I didn't count them, the computer helped me there. As we shall see anon, the word turns up with special frequency in regard to the Holy Spirit, but another particularly prominent context for its usage is Aquinas' discussion of creation, wherein God is typically characterized as the one who dat esse, who gives being. What I shall endeavor to show first is that, granted the Derridean prerequisites of presence and utter gratuitousness, the truest gift possible is that which comes from God in the act of creation. Although these issues are broached frequently in Thomas's writing, perhaps the clearest and most succinct presentation is found in a text from the very beginning of the Master's career, composed in the early 1250s, namely the De Ente et Essentia. The young Aquinas uses the distinction between essence and existence to clarify both the nature of God and the unique relationship that obtains between the infinite God and finite things. In chapter 4 of the De Ente et Essentia, Thomas proves the reality of the distinction between the two principles through a kind of thought experiment. It is altogether possible, he says, to consider a quidditas, an essence, apart from the actual existence of the essence under consideration. One can think, he suggests, of the nature of a phoenix, even though no such animal actually exists. Putting the matter in an even broader context, we can notice, he says, the demarcation in the very fact that nothing in our immediate experience has to exist, that nothing in the world, in a word, possesses a nature that requires actual existence. Now, in regard to those things in which this real metaphysical distinction obtains, we must look for an extrinsic cause. Or to state the matter a bit differently, for an agent that affected the juxtaposition of essence and existence, some cause that actualized this particular potentiality toward being. Following a logical rhythm familiar from many of his later writings, the young Thomas argues that this extrinsic cause is either itself self-explanatory or derived from a cause extrinsic to its nature. Since a chain of caused causes, subordinated per se, cannot proceed infinitely, we must arrive finally at some reality whose nature is to be, in whom essence and existence coincide, and who is therefore responsible for the being of any and all things in whom essence and existence are distinct. This unconditioned reality, Thomas continues, can only be characterized as actus purus, pure act or energy, precisely because it cannot by definition be delimited in its being, either by an extrinsic cause or an intrinsic principle. Anything marked by the play between essence and existence could be further actualized, rendered more perfect, but the reality in whom essence and existence coincide could not possibly be improved in any way or more fully realized. Nothing could add to its being, even in principle. It could benefit from no ontological gift. It is this utterly distinctive and strange source of finite existence, Thomas concludes, that thoughtful people call God. Now, what does this analysis tell us about the creaturely mode of existence? Here I turn to the great text on creation in both the Summa Theologiae and the disputed question De Potentia. From the essence-essay distinction, Thomas draws the logical conclusion that the coming to be of finite things must be continual and ex nihilo. Since nothing in the nature of a creature requires it to be, its ongoing existence must be the result of the continual influence of the one in whom essence and existence come together. Moreover, since the entirety of the creature's being is dependent, the creative act by which it is sustained must be distinguished from all forms of making or fashioning from something pre-existent. God does not shape anything to form a creature. Creation is not, by the same token, a type of motion, since it involves no transition from potency to act, nor is it a temporal act, since time is the measure of motion. In the De Potentia, Thomas gives this rather apophatic description of creation. Quaedam relatio ad creatorem cum novitate essendi, a kind of relation to the Creator with freshness or newness of being. He's using the familiar Aristotelian category of relation, but, as is his wont, he's giving it a radically transformed meaning. On the standard reading, a relation obtains between two things, but in regard to creation, this cannot be the case, since there is literally nothing independent of the act of creation by which God establishes the relationship. In a formulation I've always found Zen-like in its oddness, Thomas says that God brings into being that which receives the very act of creation. From this exposition, we must conclude that every creature in its entirety is a sheer and unadulterated gift. For there is quite literally nothing in the to be of the creature that has not been given. The same could not be said of finite things within a standard Aristotelian or Platonic context. Thomas, we might argue, has given careful metaphysical expression to St. Paul's observation. What do you have that you've not received? And in the second place, we must conclude that the source of creaturely being has absolutely no need of creation. The entire universe, even in principle, could add nothing to God's perfection, for any such addition would be repugnant to God's unconditioned mode of existence. As one of my great mentors, Robert Sokolowski, one of the most trenchant analysts of the metaphysics of creation, once put it, God plus the world is not greater than God alone. After creation, Sokolowski famously said, there are more beings, but no more perfection of being. We might usefully contrast this account with the theologies emerging from the Greek and Roman myths, according to which the gods are co-implicated with the world in a range of shared obligations and needs, as well as with Hegelianism and its many offshoots, which call for a rapport of mutual dependency between God and creation. The classical philosophical accounts, the mythic presentations, and the Hegelian construals of the God-world relationship would accordingly all be susceptible to the Derridean critique of the gift. But Thomas Aquinas' is not. Thomas's explanation allows for both conditions of giftedness to be realized simultaneously. Once we've grasped the truth of the essence-existence distinction in creatures, we understand that their being is not their own, that they indeed present themselves to thoughtful minds. They show up in the world in gift form. This metaphysical truth, by the way, is beautifully honored in the German expression for there is, simply es gibt, right? It gives. Thus, the criterion of presence is met. More to it, the one who ultimately gives the gift, the one who by his nature simply is, cannot even in principle benefit from what he offers. And thus the criterion of sheer liberality is met. The aporia of the gift evanesces in light of Thomas's metaphysics. There's a beautiful text from question 44, article 4 of the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, which I think catches so many aspects of this uniquely generous rapport between the one who is and those things that are. Under the aegis of considering whether God is the final cause of all creatures, Thomas speaks of the manner in which creaturely agents act. I'm now quoting from Thomas. Some things, however, are both agent and patient at the same time. They do and they receive. These are imperfect agents, and to these it belongs to intend, even while acting, the acquisition of something. But it does not belong to the first agent, who is agent only, to act for the acquisition of some end. Created actors, in other words, even as they influence others, are themselves influenced. Even as they give to others, they themselves receive. But this type of mutuality cannot obtain in regard to God. That's good news. That's good news for us. The first objection to the article has I'm quoting now from the first objector to this same question. It would seem that God is not the final cause of all things, for to act for an end seems to imply the need of an end, but God needs nothing. Therefore, it does not become him to act for an end. Aquinas' typically pithy response, I think, seems to anticipate the concerns of Marcel Mauss and Jacques Derrida by 7 centuries. Here's I'm quoting from Thomas. To act from need belongs only to an imperfect agent, which by its nature is both agent and patient. But this does not belong to God, and therefore he alone is the most perfectly liberal giver. Here's the Latin. Ideo ipse solus est maxime liberalis. It's beautiful. God can give an utterly free way, because he does not act for his own profit, but only on account of his own goodness. That's the end of Thomas's lovely quote. Okay, with that in mind, let's turn now to this issue which was much contested in Thomas's time and has become a very lively issue in theology today, namely what God's highest name would be. What's the right way to name God? The upshot of the foregoing discussion is that God's capacity truly to give is predicated upon God's absolutely unique manner of existence, giving following from being. And this clarification brings to mind a debate that was of keen importance to the medievals and that's been resurrected in our time by a former student of Jacques Derrida and one of the most prominent Catholic philosophers in the world. Jean-Luc Marion has wrestled for decades with the aporias and possibilities of the idea of giftedness, and he argues this in his influential text, Dieu sans l'être, right, God without being, that goodness is God's highest or most proper name, and that the title being, or the one who is, carries with it the danger of a kind of conceptual idolatry. Showing why he's wrong about this, that's my judgment, will help us to refine our answer to Derrida's original challenge. Jean-Luc Marion argues that the name existence or being falls so neatly into our cognitive categories that when we ascribe it to God, we run the severe risk of reducing God to the level of comprehensible things. Hence the application of the concept of esse to God, even when pushed and expanded in the direction of total transcendence, tends, he thinks, to foster in the mind of the philosopher a kind of intellectual complacency, a sense of having corralled or understood God. Calling explicitly into question the tradition running from Thomas Aquinas to Etienne Gilson that defends the thesis that qui est is God's highest name, Marion sides with Thomas's Franciscan counterpart, Saint Bonaventure, who famously argues in The Mind's Road to God that though being is God's highest Old Testament name, goodness or love is a higher name still, since it designates the play of the Trinitarian persons. So look in The Mind's Road to God for the details of that argument. Even as Bonaventure honors the name qui est, it's the second best name of God, not the highest name. Bonaventure, and Marion follows him here, adopt the Platonic Dionysian view that the good, that which gives, is beyond the beings, to use Plato's term. That is to say, metaphysically antecedent to the gift of existence itself. And this transcendence of even the most abstract category of the mind implies that the language of goodness applied to God is less susceptible to idolatrous misuse and can serve as a properly iconic manner of naming the divine reality. That's the idol-icon distinction in Marion, the icon that you move through it to the reality, the idol that gets your mind stuck. He thinks esse is a more idolatrous term than the good. Now, I think a careful consideration of Thomas's text on the matter of divine naming sheds quite a bit of light on the general problem we've been addressing in this paper. First observation, no one can possibly doubt that Aquinas had a thoroughgoing knowledge of this Dionysian tradition, which he first took in as a young apprentice to Albertus Magnus, and which he continued to integrate into his own work throughout his career. Père Chenu is certainly correct in asserting that Dionysius' Exitus Reditus program provides the chief structuring element in Thomas's mature theological program. And the Dionysian influence is especially clear in Aquinas' treatment of God's nature, creation, and theological language. So he loves Dionysius, knows it very well, and thus it's of considerable interest, I think, to note that Aquinas consciously and repeatedly departs from the Dionysian heritage on this key question of God's highest name. His reasons must have been pretty serious ones. In other words, this is not a casual disagreement he's having here with Dionysius. Now, there are two principal passages from the second Summa I think worth examining. The first is question 5, article 2 of the Prima Pars, which considers whether good is prior in idea to being, the familiar Dionysian proposal. In his typically crisp response, Thomas argues that what is prior in idea is what is first conceived by the intellect. But the first thing the intellect can possibly conceive is being, since actuality is the objective correlate of any and all acts of knowledge. Here's Aquinas. Hence, being is the proper object of the intellect and is primarily intelligible, as sound is what is primarily audible. But what of the explicit Dionysian priority given to the good? Thomas answers this objection by a subtle but crucial elision of terms in an Aristotelian direction. For the Stagirite, and Thomas follows him here, goodness always has the nature of an end, that is to say, of something desirable. As such, it has a sort of causal primacy over being, since even prime matter is moved to form by its attraction to an end. However, precisely as an end, the good must be equivalent to some perfection of being, since actuality is what any agent seeks. Hence, being reasserts itself in the prime position. This Aristotelian transposition allows Aquinas to recover the Dionysian assertion that the good is diffusive of itself, the beautiful bonum diffusivum sui. He returns often to that principle. But not so much in terms of efficient causality, but of final causality. That's topic for another paper, but a very interesting little elision there that allows Thomas to use the old adage, but in a transformed way. What permits God to give so dramatically and over such a universal range is once again the properly unconditioned quality of his manner of being. The second principal text to examine is question 13, article 11 of the Prima Pars, in which Thomas explicitly asks, here's the quote, whether this name, qui est, he who is the most proper name of God. The second objector cuts to the issue raised from the Pseudo-Dionysius to Jean-Luc Marion. I'm quoting now from the second objection. The name of good excellently manifests all the processions of God, but it especially belongs to God to be the universal principle of all things. Therefore, this name good is supremely proper to God, and not the name he who is. The objector is referring, of course, not simply to the procession of finite things from God in creation, but of the more primordial processions that obtain within the Trinity. Thus, he implicitly gives voice to the Bonaventurian objection that being, however sacred a name, is an Old Testament designation, superseded by the New Testament name of goodness or love. Now, before turning to Thomas's answer to this particular objection, let's look at the substance of the respondio. Since he argues the name being designates not any particular mode of existence, but existence itself, and since God is uniquely to be categorized as ipsum esse, this term is maximally appropriate to God. His second argument hinges on the universality of the name he who is. I'm quoting again. For all other names are either less universal or, if convertible with it, add something above it, at least an idea. Hence, in a certain way, they inform and determine it. Once again, following his Aristotelian instinct, Thomas says that the name good is simply convertible with the name being, since the desirable and the actual coincide. I'm always desiring something actual, right? Moreover, in the measure that goodness designates causality, it modifies or specifies the idea of being, occupying therefore a less universal place in the conceptual hierarchy. And this is precisely the approach he takes in responding to that Dionysian second objector. The name good, Thomas insists, is indeed the principal name of God, insofar as he's a cause, and then the famous adage, bonum diffusivum sui. But it does not designate the divine being in itself, now I'm quoting again, for existence considered absolutely comes before the idea of a cause. This might function indeed as the best one-line summary of the argument I've been making in this paper. In line with the adage nemo dat quod non habet, Thomas maintains that whatever truth is conveyed by the name good is necessarily subordinate to and conditioned by the truth conveyed by the name esse. Or to transpose this discussion from the linguistic to the metaphysical dimension, it's only because God exists in such a distinctive manner that he's able to give in such an utterly generous and gratuitous way. Now, the Holy Spirit as donum or gift. To this point, we've been following Thomas's teaching regarding God as such in relation to the created realm. But I want to move now into even deeper waters, searching out the play between being and gift that can be found within the Trinitarian relations. One of the deftest moves that Aquinas makes is to show that the simplicity of the divine nature and the plurality of the divine persons are not only not mutually repugnant, but in fact mutually implicative. We might characterize the logical moves as follows. Because God is simple, God must be perfect, since simplicity implies pure actuality. But if God is perfect, he must be in possession of every ontological perfection, including intelligence. And if God is intelligent and his intelligence unlimited, then he must be able to form an imago of himself, an interior word. Further, through his intelligence, he must grasp the interior word as supremely good, and hence he must love it, since will is a consequence of understanding the good as good. Therefore, the very simplicity of God implies a relationship between Father, the generator of the interior word, the Son, the interior word, and the Holy Spirit, the love that obtains between Father and Son. Though love indeed is a principal name of the Spirit, the other great name for the third person of the Trinity, says Aquinas, is donum, gift. And this brings us back to our central theme. St. Thomas explores the ramifications and implications of this mode of nomination in question 38, Article 2 of the Prima Pars. Here's the utrum: whether gift is the proper name of the Holy Spirit. In his Respondio, Aquinas cites Aristotle to the effect that, quote, a gift is properly an unreturnable giving. Derrida, right? Pure gratuitousness. Donum propria est datio irredibilis, and hence carries with it the sense of gratuitous donation. However, the ratio or intelligible form of gratuitous donation is love, since we give a gift, here's Aquinas again, only for as much as we wish someone well, the nature of love. Therefore, it follows that love, quote, has the nature of a first gift through which all gifts are given. It's lovely. I mean, that has to be the context of any and all gifts is love. This is why Augustine can say, I'm quoting again, by the gift which is the Holy Spirit, many particular gifts are portioned out to the members of Christ. This indeed explains how the Holy Spirit is the metaphysical matrix of both the act of creation and, as we'll see more clearly in the next section, the gracing that enables human beings to participate in the divine life. But what I want to make clear is that the condition for the possibility of this kind of donation, even within the inner life of the Trinity, is precisely the simplicity shared by the Father and the Son. Were the Father to benefit in any sense from the Son or the Son from the Father, then the love that they share would not be absolute. It would be marked, in fact, by a kind of Derridean economy of exchange. Therefore, in singling out the proper name of the Holy Spirit, Thomas has, in fact, uncovered the ultimate solution of the aporia of the gift. Now, just a brief meditation on the indwelling of the Spirit. What enables us really to be gift givers is only this inner reality in God. After this rather heady exploration of the nature of God, the act of creation, and the Trinitarian relations, let's turn in this brief section to the ground and the very concrete observations of the postmoderns regarding the impossibility of interpersonal gift giving. See, I think the observations made by Derrida and his colleagues are, in point of fact, quite right. It is virtually impossible within a purely natural framework to offer a true gift, especially when we take into account our fallen condition. Most realistic political philosophers, I'm thinking everybody from Aristotle through Augustine, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Adam Smith, John Rawls, all take for granted that elements of self-interest inevitably mark every type of human interaction at the natural level. A society, great or small, based on authentic gift-giving is correctly viewed by purely natural observers as utopian. What makes all the difference is the peculiar Christian claim that the divine manner of being and action that we've been exploring can, through grace, become our manner of being and action. Those who are, naturally speaking, utterly incapable of escaping the economy of exchange can become sons and daughters of the God whose very nature is disinterested love. And this brings us to a consideration of the divine missions and the indwelling of the one whose proper name is donum, gift. St. Thomas treats of the divine sendings in question 43 of the Prima Pars. To be sure, all three persons of the Trinity are in any and all creatures through, quote, essence, presence, and power, in the measure that God the Creator sustains them in being. However, particular divine persons are said to be sent inasmuch as they commence to exist in rational creatures in a new way, dwelling in them, in Thomas's lovely phrase, as in his own temple. Specifically, the Son is sent in the sense that he becomes the object of a rational creature's intellect, and the Spirit in the sense that he becomes the object of the creature's will. Possessed, as it were, by the Holy Spirit, the human will becomes radically ordered to the love that the Spirit is. Or to state the same thing in different words, it receives the theological virtue of charity. In question 62, Article 3 of the Prima Secundae, we find this extraordinary description of this greatest of the theological virtues. I'm quoting, "A certain spiritual union whereby the will is, so to speak, transformed into that end." That is to say, into the Holy Spirit itself. Throughout his treatment of the divine missions and the theological virtues, Thomas makes frequent reference to the text of 2 Peter, according to which we become participants in the divine nature. This discussion segues neatly into the description of charity in the Secunda Secundae as a type of friendship with God. Following Aristotle's famous description, Thomas argues that friendship is indeed a relationship in which each partner wills the good of the other, distinguishing it from relationships of utility. But the angelic doctor moves beyond Aristotle and says that real mutuality communication must obtain in authentic friendship. Talis autem mutua benevolentia fundatur super aliqua communicatione, says Aquinas. This ecstatic communication occurs when God wills our happiness and we will the glory of God, which redounds in turn to our greater happiness. Possessed by the Holy Spirit, in a word, we can love with the very love with which God loves us. Therefore, we can give gifts as generously as God does. How can we resolve this aporia of the gift? It seems to me we can do so only through recourse to God and those whom God deigns to make saints. So, there we have the abstract description of the central dynamic. But what does this transformed life look like? How does the solution to the aporia of the gift show up in the world? Here we have to turn, it seems to me, to the moral teachings of the Lord, which can indeed be construed as a series of commands, but commands given not to the natural person, but to the one who's been supernaturalized, the one to whom Jesus can reasonably say, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." The new life that Jesus urges, or better, that he makes possible, is one of absolutely radical gift giving. So listen, you've heard it said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy," but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In the ordinary dispensation, one loves those to whom he's already connected, and therefore from whom he can expect some kind of compensation, emotional or otherwise. But in the new dispensation, love must be given precisely to those who will not return the favor. Jesus makes the principle eminently clear. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? There's the undoing of the aporia of the gift. In Luke's Sermon on the Plain, we find something very similar. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do as much. If you lend to those for whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to receive much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. See, how's that possible? How's that possible? That's not possible, it seems to me, within a natural framework. In doing so, you will indeed be like your heavenly Father. Notice, please, who makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. That's the way God is able to give. And to give just one more example of the principle, this from the 14th chapter of Luke. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return, and you be repaid. When you give a banquet, Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. This is the undoing of the hostis hospitality problem raised by Ben Veniste. It's the dissolving of the gift dilemma presented by Derrida. What cuts the Gordian knot is nothing other than the gratia, the gift-giving capacity of the one who cannot even in principle be repaid. This is the way the people who've been invaded by the Holy Spirit, the Donum Dei, are able to live. Okay, just a few words of conclusion. In a way, the dilemma of the gift is a particularly eloquent way of expressing the spiritual struggle at the heart of every person in our finite, fallen, and conflictual world. On the one hand, we want to give, for giving is the very nature of God, and consciously or not, we're all striving for union with God. But on the other hand, we can't give, for we are, as Derrida and company have correctly intuited, caught in the grip of the economic exchange. What becomes clear is that the aporia of the gift is not merely an intellectual conundrum, but a real spiritual predicament. Thomas Aquinas' technical descriptions of God, creation, and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit clarify the mind, to be sure, but they also, and more importantly, liberate the captive soul. What the postmodern thinkers considered an obstacle to religious belief, in point of fact functions as a particularly radiant light to illuminate the Christian mystery. God bless you all. Thanks for listening today.